The year was 1575, and the small Dutch town of Oudwater was a powder keg of tension. The Spanish forces, determined to crush the rebellion against their rule, were closing in. Jacob Harmenszoon, a young boy with a bright future, was unaware of the impending disaster. His father, a skilled smith, had died when Jacob was just a baby, leaving his mother to raise him and his siblings. But on August 8, 1575, everything changed. The Spanish army stormed into Oudwater and in a brutal act of retaliation massacred nearly everyone in the town. Jacob's entire family was among the victims. Orphaned and alone, Jacob found himself thrust into a world of chaos and uncertainty. But fate, it seemed, had other plans for him. A local priest named Theodore Aemilius, who had a reputation for his Protestant leanings, took Jacob under his wing. Aemilius became more than just a teacher. He was a father figure, guiding Jacob through his early years and introducing him to the world of theology and philosophy. Under Aemilius's tutelage, Jacob's natural curiosity and intellectual prowess began to flourish. When Aemilius passed away in 1575, Jacob's journey continued. A professor from the University of Marburg, Rodolphus Snellius, saw potential in the young boy and offered to sponsor his education. Jacob moved to Marburg, where he spent a year immersed in the world of academia. It was during this time that he adopted the Latinized name Jacobus Arminius, a name that would later become synonymous with a theological movement that would challenge the very foundations of the Reformed Church. In 1576, Arminius enrolled at the University of Leiden, a prestigious institution in his homeland. Here he encountered a diverse range of ideas and perspectives. The city of Leiden was a hub of intellectual activity, and the university was a melting pot of different theological and philosophical schools of thought. Arminius excelled in his studies, delving into subjects like mathematics, logic, and theology. He also became fluent in the biblical languages, a skill that would serve him well in his future endeavors. While at Leiden, Arminius found himself drawn to the teachings of a local pastor named Caspar Koolhaas. Koolhaas was known for his more tolerant and independent views, particularly regarding the relationship between church and state. Unlike John Calvin, who believed that the church should have complete authority over civil matters, Koolhaas argued that the civil authorities had a role to play in church affairs. This more balanced approach resonated with Arminius, who began to question some of the more rigid aspects of Calvinist doctrine. In 1581, Arminius completed his studies at Leiden. However, he was still too young to be appointed as a pastor. The clergy and magistrates in Amsterdam, recognizing his potential, offered to support him for further education at Calvin's Academy in Geneva. It was a prestigious opportunity, and Arminius eagerly accepted. Geneva, at the time, was the epicenter of the Reformed movement. The chair of theology was held by Theodore Beza, Calvin's successor, who was known for his strict and uncompromising interpretation of Calvinist doctrine. Beza's teachings, often referred to as hyper-Calvinism, emphasized the absolute sovereignty of God and the predestination of individuals to salvation or damnation. Arminius, despite his admiration for Beza's intellect, began to feel increasingly uneasy with these ideas. During his time in Geneva, Arminius was involved in a controversy, but it was not over predestination. Instead, it was a dispute over logic, which led him to spend a year studying at the University of Basel. There, he was influenced by the professor J.J. Grenäus, a Lutheran with Zwinglian views. Grenäus' more moderate and tolerant approach to theology further shaped Arminius's thinking. Arminius returned to Geneva in 1583, where he continued his studies under Beza. Despite their differences, Beza spoke highly of Arminius, praising his life and learning. However, the seeds of doubt had already been planted, and Arminius's views were beginning to diverge from the strict Calvinist orthodoxy. In 1586, the burgomasters in Amsterdam decided it was time for Arminius to return and take up his duties as a pastor. Before leaving, Arminius and a friend made a brief trip to Italy, which included a hasty visit to Rome. Later, his critics would accuse him of consorting with the Pope, but these claims were baseless and motivated by a desire to discredit him. Arminius arrived in Amsterdam in late 1587, and on August 27, 1588, he was ordained as a pastor. He quickly gained a reputation as a skilled and popular preacher, drawing large crowds whenever he spoke. His sermons, particularly those on the Book of Romans, were well received, but it was not until he reached chapter 7 in 1591 that the first signs of controversy began to emerge. Arminius' journey from a small-town orphan to a respected theologian and pastor was marked by a series of challenges and influences. Each step along the way shaped his thinking and set the stage for the theological revolution that would bear his name. As he stood in the pulpit, ready to deliver his next sermon, Arminius knew that the road ahead would be fraught with controversy, but he was determined to follow the path of truth, wherever it might lead. Arminius was a man caught in the middle of a heated religious debate. It all started when a humanist named Dirk Cornert began criticizing Calvinism, the dominant religious view of the time. Cornert's arguments were so strong that two Reformed ministers in Delft felt the need to modify some of Beza's teachings, which were closely tied to Calvinism. Beza was a close follower of John Calvin, and his ideas were widely accepted. Arminius, who was a respected minister and theologian, was asked to join the debate. He was supposed to either refute the Delft ministers or Cornert himself, or both. But as Arminius delved deeper into the scriptures, he began to see things differently. He realized that the Bible didn't fully support the strict Calvinist view of predestination, which is the idea that God has already decided who will be saved and who will be damned, regardless of what people do. One of the first major conflicts came in 1591 when Arminius preached on Romans 7. The High Calvinists believed that the person described in verses 14 to 24 was a regenerate person, someone who had already been saved. Arminius, however, argued that this person must be a sinner, or else God's power to save would be ineffective. This caused a lot of controversy, and a fellow minister named Petrus Plancius accused Arminius of teaching Pelagianism, a heresy that suggests people can be saved by their own efforts without God's help. Plancius also said that Arminius was straying from the core beliefs of the Reformed Church, as outlined in the Belgic Confession and the Heidelberg Catechism. The city leaders, known as burgomasters, got involved to keep the peace. They supported Arminius and told his critics to wait until a general church council could decide the matter. This didn't stop the controversy, though. A year later, in 1592, Arminius preached on Romans 9, another chapter that deals with predestination. Plancius accused Arminius of teaching that no one is condemned except by their own sin, which contradicted the idea that God predestines some people to be damned. Plancius also said that Arminius was giving too much importance to good works, and that he had claimed angels are not immortal. Arminius defended himself by saying that he was only talking about original sin, and that he had never suggested that good works could earn salvation. He also clarified that he believed only God is immortal by nature. Despite the controversy, Arminius continued his work as a minister and theologian. He wrote many treatises, including one on Romans 7, where he argued that the person in the passage is unregenerate or not yet saved. He also wrote about Romans 9, explaining that God's mercy is free and that he chooses to save those who believe, not those he has arbitrarily predestined. In 1602, Arminius was appointed as a professor of theology at the University of Leiden, a position he held until his death in 1609. His appointment was met with strong opposition from Franciscus Gomarus, a prominent Calvinist professor. The main point of contention was predestination. Gomarus and other strict Calvinists believed that God's decision to save or condemn people was unconditional, and that God had foreordained all events. Arminius, on the other hand, believed that God's election of people to salvation was based on their faith, and that God's foreknowledge of their choices did not make those choices necessary. The debate had political implications as well. The war party, led by Prince Maurice, wanted complete independence from Spain and favored a more rigid Calvinist view. The peace party, led by Jan van Oldenbarnevelt, was more open to a truce with Spain and supported a more tolerant theological stance. Arminius and his followers were part of the peace party. In 1607, the States General, the governing body of the Netherlands, considered convening a national synod to address the theological disputes. Arminius and his supporters wanted the synod to have the power to revise the confessions, but their opponents resisted. In 1608, Arminius petitioned the States General for a legal inquiry into his situation. This led to a meeting where Arminius and Gomarus presented their views. Arminius wrote his Declaration of Sentiments, outlining his beliefs, including the idea that God's election is based on foreknowledge of faith. The controversy continued to escalate, and in 1609, the States General called for a friendly conference between Arminius and Gomarus. However, Arminius fell ill and had to return home, and the conference was dismissed. Arminius never finished his written response and died on October 19, 1609. After Arminius's death, his followers, known as Remonstrants, presented a petition to the States General in 1610. This petition, called the Remonstrants, outlined their main points, including the idea that God's election is based on foreknowledge of faith and that people can fall from grace. The Remonstrants were led by figures like Wittenbogaert, Simon Episcopius, and Hugo Grotius, and they had the support of Jan van Oldenbarnevelt. The controversy did not end with Arminius's death. The Remonstrants and the Contra-Remonstrants continued to clash, and the debate over predestination and grace would shape the religious landscape of the Netherlands for years to come. If you want to understand what Calvinists believe about predestination, you need to first understand their view of God, man, and salvation. Let's break it down. Calvinists believe that God is the ultimate ruler of everything. He is in control, and nothing happens without his permission. This means that God is free to do whatever he wants, and nothing can stop him. His actions are always in line with his own perfect nature. He doesn't have to follow anyone else's rules or meet anyone else's expectations. He is the boss, and everything in the universe is under his control. God is also the creator and sustainer of everything. Everything that exists, including all the events that happen, is because God willed it to be so. This means that nothing is out of his control. There are no surprises for God. He knows everything that will happen, and he has a plan for everything. Nothing can happen by chance or accident. Even the smallest details, like the movement of atoms, are under his control. God is all-knowing. He knows everything that will happen, and he knew it all before he created the world. He considered all the possible outcomes of his decisions and chose the best plan. So, his knowledge is the same as his will. He knows something will happen because he decided it would happen. God's will cannot be stopped. Since he is the most powerful being, nothing can prevent him from doing what he wants. If something could stop God, it would be more powerful than God, which is impossible. So everything that happens is part of God's plan, and nothing can change that. God is good, and he deserves all the glory. He is the source of all that is good, and no one else can take credit for anything good. We are nothing without God, and he is the one who gives us everything. Calvinists believe that man is a creation of God. This means that man is completely under God's control and has no right to demand anything from God. God doesn't owe man anything, and he doesn't have to explain his actions to man. Man is entirely dependent on God for everything. Now, let's talk about predestination. Predestination is the idea that God decided, before the world was created, who would be saved and who would not. This decision is based on God's sovereign will, and it cannot be changed. Election is the part of predestination where God chooses who will be saved. Calvinists believe that God chose a specific group of people, called the elect, to be saved. This choice is not based on anything the people did or will do. It is purely based on God's will. God decided to save these people because he wanted to, and he did it out of his grace and mercy. Reprobation is the other part of predestination. It refers to the people who God did not choose to save. Calvinists believe that God also decided, before the world was created, who would not be saved. This decision is also based on God's will, and it cannot be changed. According to Calvinists, God's plan for salvation is like a puzzle. He decided the final picture before he even started putting the pieces together. He knew exactly who would be saved and who would not. He then created the world and set everything in motion to make sure his plan would come true. When it comes to salvation, God does all the work. The people he chose to save are given the grace to believe in him and follow him. They are saved because God made them able to believe. The people he did not choose to save are left to their own devices and cannot believe, no matter how hard they try. For Calvinists, faith is a gift from God. The people who are saved are given the ability to believe by God. They don't earn their salvation or choose it on their own. It is all because of God's grace. The people who are not saved do not receive this gift of faith, and they remain in their sin. The purpose of all this, according to Calvinists, is to glorify God. God is the only one who deserves credit for salvation. He is the one who decided who would be saved, and he is the one who made it happen. Everything is about giving glory to God and showing his power and grace. One of the biggest challenges with this view is the question of fairness. If God chose some people to be saved and not others, does that mean he is unfair? Calvinists would say no, because God is the creator and has the right to do as he pleases. They also believe that everyone deserves to be punished for their sin, so being saved is a gift, not a right. Another challenge is the idea of free will. If God decided everything before the world was created, does that mean we don't have free will? Calvinists believe that we do have free will, but our choices are always within the bounds of God's plan. We can't choose to be saved if God hasn't given us the gift of faith. Understanding the Calvinistic view of predestination means understanding God's sovereignty, man's dependence, and the purpose of salvation. It's a complex idea, but it all comes down to one thing. God is in control, and everything is part of his plan. The idea that humans are fallen and sinful is at the heart of many religious beliefs. This means that because of our nature, we are not good and cannot do anything that would earn us favor with God. Even our best efforts, like trying to be good or believe in God, are not enough. This belief is called total depravity. It means that we are bound by our own sinfulness and cannot choose to follow God on our own. When it comes to salvation, this idea leads to the belief that God alone is responsible for saving us. We can't do anything to earn it, and even our faith is a gift from God. This is called soteriology, which is a fancy word for the study of how we are saved. The focus is entirely on what God does, not on what we do. God's grace, or His unearned favor, is the only reason anyone is saved. Since we are totally depraved, we can't do anything to deserve it. This leads to the idea that God has a specific plan for who will be saved. This plan is called predestination. It means that God has already decided who will be saved and who won't. This might sound unfair, but the belief is that God's plan is just, and that He has reasons for His choices that we don't fully understand. To understand predestination, we need to look at God's overall plan, which is called the decrees of God. This means that God has a plan for everything that happens, from the smallest details to the biggest events. This plan is eternal, meaning it has always existed, and it is immutable, meaning it never changes. God's plan is also comprehensive, covering everything that happens, including the free choices that people make. One important part of God's plan is how He deals with sin. God allows sin to happen, but He doesn't cause it. He has reasons for allowing sin, such as showing His mercy and compassion. Even though sin is allowed, God ultimately uses it for good and for His own glory. This is a mystery, and we can't fully understand how it works, but we trust that God has a good reason for everything. Another part of God's plan is how He saves people. This is called election, and it means that God has chosen some people to be saved. This choice is based on God's own good pleasure, not on anything the person has done. God's choice is eternal, meaning it has always been, and it is immutable, meaning it will never change. God's choice is also irresistible, meaning that nothing can stop God from saving those He has chosen. This doesn't mean that God forces people to believe. Instead, He works in their hearts to make them willing. On the other side, there is reprobation, which means that God has also chosen some people not to be saved. This is a difficult idea, but it is based on the belief that God is just and that everyone deserves punishment for their sin. God's choice to not save some people is also eternal and immutable. It is not because of anything the person has done, but because of God's own reasons. The idea of predestination can be hard to understand, but it is a central part of many religious beliefs. It means that God is in control of everything, and His plan is perfect, even if we can't see it. The focus is always on God's grace and His plan, not on what we can do to earn salvation. This can be a comforting idea, as it means that our salvation is secure and depends on God, not on our own efforts. In the world of theology, one of the most debated topics is the concept of predestination. This chapter explores the differences between the Calvinist and Arminian views on predestination, focusing on the Arminian perspective. Calvinists and Arminians share many beliefs about God, humanity, and salvation. Both agree that God is sovereign, meaning He is in control of everything, and nothing can happen without His permission. They also agree that humans are fallen and sinful, and that salvation is a gift from God, not something we can earn. However, the key difference lies in how they understand God's sovereignty and human free will. Calvinists believe that God has predestined some people to be saved and others to be damned. This means that God has chosen who will be saved and who will not. And this choice is based on His own will, not on anything the person does. Arminians, on the other hand, believe that God has predestined salvation for those who will freely choose to believe in Him. This means that God's choice is based on His foreknowledge of who will choose to follow Him. One of the main points of disagreement is the relationship between certainty, contingency, and necessity. Calvinists often argue that everything that happens is necessary because God has decreed it. This means that everything is predetermined and there is no real choice. Arminians, however, believe that while God knows everything that will happen, many events are contingent, meaning they can go one way or another. For example, if you are at a fork in the road, you can choose to go left or right. God knows which way you will choose, but you still have the freedom to make that choice. Arminians also emphasize the importance of human free will in the process of salvation. They believe that God's grace is available to everyone, but it is up to each person to accept or reject it. This means that God's offer of salvation is sincere and genuine, even if not everyone will accept it. Calvinists, on the other hand, believe that God's grace is irresistible, meaning that those who are chosen by God will be saved, no matter what. Another point of contention is the order of God's decrees. Calvinists often debate whether God's decision to allow the fall of humanity came before or after His decision to elect some to salvation. Some Calvinists, known as suprapsarians, believe that God decided to create some for salvation and some for damnation before He allowed the fall. Others, known as infralapsarians, believe that God decided to allow the fall first and then chose to save some from the fallen state. Arminians, however, see the fall as a real event that happened because of human free will. They believe that God's decision to save some people came after the fall, based on His foreknowledge of who would choose to believe in Him. This means that God's plan for salvation is responsive to human choices rather than predetermined. Arminians also believe that God is actively working to bring people to faith, even if they ultimately reject it. They see the Holy Spirit as striving with all people, convicting them of their sin and calling them to repentance. This is part of what is known as common grace, where God shows kindness to all people, regardless of whether they will be saved. In the end, both Calvinists and Arminians agree that God is sovereign and that salvation is a gift. However, they differ in how they understand the relationship between God's sovereignty and human free will. Calvinists emphasize God's sovereignty to the point of predestination, while Arminians emphasize human free will and the sincerity of God's offer of salvation. This debate has been ongoing for centuries, and it continues to shape the way people understand God, humanity, and the nature of salvation. Whether you lean more towards the Calvinist or Arminian view, it's important to remember that both perspectives are trying to make sense of God's mysterious and wonderful plan for the world. Arminius, a theologian, observed that God, in His infinite wisdom, saw from the beginning of time that humans would fall. This fall was certain because God knew it would happen, but it didn't happen because God made it happen. Instead, it happened because God knew it would, based on His perfect knowledge, not because He forced it to happen. Arminius explained that there's a difference between things that happen certainly and things that happen necessarily. Certainty is about God's perfect knowledge, which means He knows for sure what will happen. Necessity is about God's will, which means he makes something happen. So God can know something will happen without making it happen. Richard Watson, a Wesleyan theologian, also talked about this. He said that just because God knows something will happen, it doesn't mean that thing isn't free. For example, if God knows you will choose to eat an apple tomorrow, it doesn't mean you can't choose to eat an orange instead. God's knowledge doesn't take away your freedom to choose. Watson explained that the mistake people make is thinking that if something is certain, it can't be free. But that's not true. Freedom in moral actions means you can choose. And it's not the same as certainty. God can know for sure what you will do, but that doesn't mean you have to do it. Your actions can be free and still be known by God. Some people, like Clark Pinnock, have a different idea. They think that God can't know what free choices people will make in the future because those choices don't exist yet. But this isn't the traditional Arminian view. Arminius and others believe that God's knowledge is perfect, and he knows all possibilities, including the choices that people will make. Arminians believe that God's foreknowledge doesn't make things happen. God's knowledge is part of his omniscience, which means he knows everything, both good and bad, necessary and contingent. God's foreordination, or his plan, is not the same as his foreknowledge. God knew what would happen and then made a plan based on that knowledge, not the other way around. Arminians also believe that God created humans with a will, which means we can make real choices. This doesn't mean we are absolutely free like God is. Our freedom is limited and affected by our fallen nature. For example, without God's grace, a sinner can't choose to be saved. But even though our freedom is limited, we are still personal beings with the ability to make real choices. This idea of human freedom doesn't take away from God's sovereignty. God is still in control of everything, and nothing happens outside his plan. But God's plan includes the free choices of humans. God is so powerful that he can create beings with free will and still govern the universe in a way that everything happens according to his plan. Arminians believe that this view of God's sovereignty and human freedom magnifies God's power and wisdom. God is able to create beings who can make real choices and still ensure that everything happens according to his plan. This shows that God is not only all-knowing, but also all-powerful. Arminians also believe that God's plan for salvation is conditional. God has decreed that salvation is available to those who freely choose to accept it. This doesn't mean that God's plan is uncertain or that it can be thwarted. God's plan is sure, but it includes the free choices of humans. In the end, Arminians and Calvinists both believe in God's sovereignty and human freedom, but they understand these ideas differently. Arminians believe that God's sovereignty is not threatened by human freedom, and that God's plan includes the real choices of humans. This view emphasizes God's wisdom and power in creating a universe where both God and humans are actors, each with their own roles to play. The idea of God's plan for humanity and how it relates to our choices is a big topic in theology. Let's break it down in a way that's easier to understand. Imagine God as a master storyteller. Before he even started the story of the universe, he had a clear idea of how it would unfold. One of the first things he decided was to create humans as free beings. This means that he wanted us to have the ability to make our own choices, to love him and others, or to turn away. This decision to create us as free beings is fundamental because it determines who we are and what we can do. Now, some people might think that if God created us, He must have already decided everything that would happen, including who would be saved and who wouldn't. But that's not how the Arminian view sees it. According to Arminians, God's decision to create us as free beings logically comes before any decisions about salvation. God couldn't plan for salvation until He had created beings who needed it and could choose it. Arminians believe that God is not the author of sin. Sin is not something that God caused or needed to happen to reveal His attributes. Instead, sin comes from the free choices of the creatures He created. God allowed us to have this freedom, and He knew that some of us would choose to sin. But He also knew that He could use even our sin to bring about His greater plan for good. God's plan for salvation is called predestination. This term is used to describe how God has decided to save people. Arminians see predestination as having two main parts: election and reprobation. Election is God's decision to save those who believe in Jesus, and reprobation is His decision to condemn those who do not believe. For Arminians, the key to understanding election is that it is centered on Jesus. God's plan to save us is not just a decree from heaven. It is a plan that is fulfilled through Jesus. Arminius, a key figure in Arminian thought, emphasized that God's love for us is only found in Jesus. This means that when God decided to save people, He did so through Jesus, not just by a decree. Arminians also believe that election is personal and individual. God has a specific plan for each person, and He knows who will choose to believe in Jesus and who won't. This doesn't mean that God forces anyone to believe. It means that He has a plan to save those who freely choose to follow Him. Election is also eternal. God's decision to save people was made before the world was created. This is why the Bible says that God chose us before the foundation of the world. Ephesians chapter 1, verse 4. This eternal decision is based on God's foreknowledge of who would believe in Jesus. The most important point for Arminians is that election is conditional. This means that God has decided to save those who believe in Jesus. Faith is the condition for salvation. If salvation is by faith, then election must also be by faith. This means that God's plan for salvation is not a secret. It is revealed in the Bible and in the life and teachings of Jesus. By understanding election in this way, Arminians avoid the idea that God has a secret will that is different from His revealed will. God's desire is for all people to be saved, and He has made a way for that to happen through Jesus. The choice is ours to believe and follow Him. This view of predestination and election helps us understand that God is both sovereign and loving. He has a plan, but He also respects our free will. He wants us to choose Him, and He has provided a way for us to do so through Jesus. In this chapter, we've explored some deep and complex ideas about God, faith, and the future. Let's break it down in simpler terms. Imagine God as a being who exists outside of time. For us, time moves forward, from the past to the present to the future. But for God, everything, past, present, and future, is visible all at once. This means that God can see what choices we will make, even before we make them. Now, some people believe that God chooses who will be saved, elected, and who won't, regardless of what we do. This is called unconditional election. Others, like the Arminians, believe that God chooses to save those who will choose to believe in Him. This is called conditional election. The key idea here is that God's choice is based on His foreknowledge of our choices. God sees us as believers or unbelievers, and He loves and chooses us accordingly. This doesn't mean that our choices are forced. They are still free and contingent, but God can see them clearly. Some people worry that if God knows everything we will do, we don't really have free will. But the Arminian view is that God's foreknowledge and our free will can coexist. God can know what we will choose without forcing us to choose it. Our choices are still our own, but God's knowledge is perfect. This idea is sometimes called predestination according to foreknowledge. It means that God's choice to save us is based on His knowledge of our future faith. This is different from saying that God's choice is based on our faith, which might imply that our faith is the cause of God's choice. Instead, God's choice is based on His perfect knowledge of what will happen. Now, how does this fit with the idea of God's sovereignty? Sovereignty means that God is in control, but it doesn't mean that He acts arbitrarily. God can choose to set conditions for salvation, and when He does, it doesn't violate His sovereignty. God is free to do as He pleases, and He has chosen to save those who will believe in Him. What about the idea of total depravity? This is the belief that fallen humans are so corrupted by sin that they cannot choose to believe in God on their own. Arminians agree that we need God's help to believe, but they also believe that God gives this help, called prevenient grace, to everyone. This grace enables us to choose faith, but it doesn't force us to choose it. So God's grace is necessary, but our response is still free. Reprobation, or the idea that some people are not chosen for salvation, is also part of this system. Arminians believe that reprobation is just and based on God's foreknowledge of who will reject Him. It's not a secret decree, but a response to the choices people make. In summary, the Arminian view of conditional election and reprobation is that God's choices are based on His perfect knowledge of our future choices. God is sovereign, and He has chosen to save those who will believe in Him. This doesn't take away our free will, but it does mean that God's knowledge and grace are essential to our salvation. Finally, there are different views on how God's foreknowledge and human freedom can coexist. Some believe that the future is open and undetermined, while others believe that God knows the future, but that this knowledge doesn't force our choices. The classic Arminian view is that God's foreknowledge and human freedom can coexist, and this is supported by the Bible and by logical reasoning. In the end, the most important thing to remember is that God's love and grace are at the heart of salvation. Whether you believe in unconditional or conditional election, the key is that God's love is available to all, and He invites us to respond in faith.